Tideline, the first time I met Alex, I was hauling in a net that was mostly plastic and dead fish. And I was thinking about how my grandfather would have beat the hell out of me if I'd come back with a catch like this. I need to explain that. Context, because understanding my grandfather is understanding why I'm still out here at 32 years old, killing an industry with my own hands. My grandfather, Frank Russo, started fishing in 1952 with nothing but a used boat he'd bought with money he'd saved from construction work and a specific kind of stubbornness that defined the entire Russo family trajectory. He was Italian second generation, immigrant parents who'd come over with nothing and built something through relentless work. My grandmother used to tell stories about how he'd sleep on that boat those first years, how he'd go out in weather that should have kept rational people in land, how he learned to read the water the way other men read newspapers. By the time my father was old enough to work, Frank had built a reputation. Not flashy, not famous in the way that modern fishermen get famous through social media and Netflix documentaries, but known in the Portland fishing community as someone who caught good fish, who treated his crew fairly, who understood the ocean in the way that comes from actually paying attention, instead of just executing a business plan. My father, Anthony Russo, expanded on that foundation. He added a second boat by the time he was 30, a third by 35. He hired skilled crews. He invested in better equipment. He built relationships with restaurants and markets that value quality over volume. By the time I was born in 1992, the Russo family wasn't just fishing. We were a fishing business. We were the kind of operation that could sustain multiple boats, multiple crews, multiple income streams. I grew up believing that this was permanent, that fishing was what we did, who we were, what tied us to place and purpose and family legacy. My father would take me out on the boat starting when I was 8 years old. He'd teach me to read the nets, to understand water conditions, to know the difference between a good day and a day where you're just going through the motions. He'd tell me stories about my grandfather, about the specific stubbornness required to stay on the water when everything is trying to kill you. Fishing isn't for everyone, he'd say, standing on the deck of whatever boat we were working that day. It's not for people who want certainty. It's not for people who need comfort. It's for people who understand that the ocean owns you, and you're just borrowing time from it. I understood that. I internalized that. I built my entire identity around that understanding. Then, around the time I turned 25, I started noticing something was wrong with the ocean. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was subtle. The fish that used to show up in certain locations weren't there anymore. The sizes were getting smaller. The bycatch, the non-target species we were accidentally catching, started increasing. The regulations that the government was implementing started getting stricter, which meant smaller catch allowances, which meant tighter profit margins. My father noticed it too, but his response was different from mine. His response was adjust and keep going. Work harder. Fish different areas. Use different methods. Stay ahead of the problem instead of acknowledging that the problem might be systemic and unsolvable. The ocean's always been tough, he'd say. My father figured it out. I figured it out. You'll figure it out too. But I wasn't sure I could figure it out. And by the time I took over as primary captain of the Mary Catherine, the boat named after my mother, I was starting to suspect that the ocean wasn't just tough. The ocean was dying. By 2024, when I was 32 years old, the reality had become impossible to ignore. My catches were declining year over year. The fish I was catching were often smaller than ideal, which meant they hadn't had time to reproduce, which meant I was contributing to population decline. The regulations were getting stricter because the science was clear. The Pacific Northwest fishing industry as it currently existed was not sustainable. The specific morning that Alex showed up, I'd been out since 4 a.m. I'd set 3 nets. The first 2 have been decent, maybe 70% of my typical catch. The third net, the one I was hauling when Alex appeared, was maybe 30% fish and 70% garbage. There were plastic bags. There was fishing line from other boats, sometimes miles of it, tangled up in expensive equipment and creating what we call ghost nets. Nets that keep catching fish long after they've been abandoned. There was a propane tank, rusted beyond recognition. There was a shoe. There were dead fish that had been caught in the tangle and couldn't escape. Some of them were the species I was targeting. Some of them were juvenile fish that should have been released. Some of them were species that had no commercial value. I was standing on the deck of the Mary Catherine, sorting through this garbage and dead fish, thinking about my grandfather. Specifically, I was thinking about how he would have recognized this as a sign that something fundamental was changing, a sign that the work we'd been doing for 70 years was becoming something else. That's when Alex climbed onto my boat without permission, without announcement, without any preamble whatsoever. Not with permission, not with a shout from the dock asking if it was okay. Just climbed aboard like that was something a person did, something they had the right to do, something that didn't require negotiation. Wearing waders and a jacket that suggested serious water work. carrying equipment that suggested scientific purpose. Young, probably late 20s, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd spent time in institutions, but hadn't let institutions entirely change how they move through physical space. "What are you doing?" I asked. Not hostile, exactly, but not welcoming. I was tired. I was frustrated. I was thinking about my grandfather and my father in the specific ways that family legacy was supposed to work. I was not in the mood for interruptions. I'm Alex Rivera, marine biologist. I'm documenting fishing impacts in the Portland zone for a research collective. They gestured at the net, at the garbage, at the dead fish. That's a good example of what I'm looking for. That's my livelihood, I said. Not an example. That's my morning's work, which is probably going to cover fuel and net maintenance and maybe not much else. That's exactly the point, Alex said. I would later understand that Alex used they, them pronouns, which would matter later in ways I didn't anticipate gestured at the specific composition of the catch. You're catching fish that are too young to reproduce. You're catching non-target species. You're catching dead fish that were trapped in garbage. This net is documenting the collapse of the ecosystem. This net is documenting my day. I said, this net is evidence of why fishing in the Pacific Northwest is no longer viable at pre-climate change. In scales, Alex said. They were already pulling out a camera, a small mirrorless device that looked expensive and professional. The ecosystem is collapsing. Fish populations are declining faster than they can reproduce. The regulations are getting stricter because the science is clear. We're running out of time. And they paused, looking at the catch, looking at me, looking at the specific reality of what was happening. You're running out of time too. I don't need a marine biologist to tell me I'm running out of time, I said. I live this every day. I wake up at 4 in the morning. I go out in weather that should keep reasonable people in land. I come back with catches that get smaller every year. I know I'm running out of time. The question is, what exactly am I supposed to do about it? Alex looked at me for a long moment. Then they said, stop fishing, okay. Well, that's not an option for me. Why not? Because I don't know how to do anything else. Because my family's been fishing for 70 years. Because my identity, my purpose, my entire understanding of who I am is tied to this work. I was aware that I was justifying myself to a stranger, which irritated me. Because stopping means losing the boat. Losing the boat means losing the business my grandfather built. Losing the business means I don't know what it means. Becoming someone different than who I've always been. Alex nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in recognition. Like they'd heard this calculation before, understood the stakes. Understood that what seemed like a simple choice to someone outside the industry was actually a choice between fundamental identity and everything else. There's another option. Alex said quietly, you don't have to stop fishing. You have to change how you fish to what? That's what I'm trying to figure out. That's what I'm documenting. They put the camera down. Can I come on a full day? A complete fishing operation? I want to understand the work, not just observe the catch. You want to spend a full day on a fishing boat documenting my work? Yeah, I'll pay. Research funding. $300 for the documentation. That was more than I'd probably make on a bad day. That was enough to cover fuel, maintenance on the nets, some of the slow creep of cost that comes with keeping an old boat operational in an industry that doesn't want you to succeed. I wanted to say no on principle, but principle doesn't pay bills. You wake up at 4:30, I said. You wear decent waders. You don't touch anything without asking. You don't talk unless I ask you to talk. And you don't judge me for doing the work that keeps me alive. Okay, Alex said. Just like that. No negotiation. No argument. Just agreement. I should have known that was a sign of what Alex was actually like. No drama. No performance. Just commitment to understanding something that mattered. But here's what I didn't know then. Alex Rivera had spent their entire life watching the ocean die incrementally and had decided to document that death scientifically, to put data behind the intuition that something was fundamentally wrong with how we were relating to the marine environment. Alex's family had been fishing to not in Portland, but in California, in the waters off Santa Cruz. Not commercial industrial scale like what I was doing, but small operations that had been sustained by generations of family knowledge. Alex's parents had understood that the ocean could only support a certain amount of extraction. They built their business around that understanding, but by the time Alex was old enough to work, even that careful, sustainable model couldn't sustain itself. The ocean was changing faster than small family operations could adapt. The larger commercial operations were taking more and more of the available fish. The regulations that were supposed to protect the ecosystem were proving inadequate. By the time Alex was 20, the family boats had been sold. The knowledge had become historical instead of practical. The industry had transformed into something that Alex's parents didn't recognize and couldn't operate within. Instead of trying to stay in an industry that was fundamentally broken, Alex had gotten out, had gone to college at UC Davis, had gotten a degree in marine biology, and had come back to the coast as a scientist instead of as a fisher, documenting what was happening to the ocean, trying to understand the data behind the intuition that something was dying. The research collective that Alex worked for was studying the impacts of commercial fishing on marine ecosystems. They were trying to understand whether fishing could be made sustainable, or whether the current model was fundamentally incompatible with a healthy ocean. Alex's specific role was interviewing fishermen, documenting their operations, collecting data about what was actually being caught and what cost to the ecosystem. This wasn't work that made Alex popular with the fishing community. Most fishermen saw marine biologists as threats, as people who didn't understand what fishing was, who saw it only as an environmental problem instead of as a way of life. Alex knew this. Alex expected it. But Alex also believed that understanding required actual engagement with fishermen, not just observation from a distance. I didn't know any of this yet. I just knew that I was angry about being judged by someone I never met. Angry about my catch being documented like it was a crime scene. Angry about the specific truth that what I was doing was probably unsustainable. And I didn't know how to do anything else. That realization felt like drowning. Get off my boat. I said, I'm documenting the fishing impacts. Alex said, not moving. I have permits. I have research authorization from the university. I have the legal right to be here. You have the legal right to be insufferable, apparently. I said, I was already moving to go back to sorting the catch to return to the work I understood. But I don't have to listen to a lecture about ecosystem collapse while I'm trying to make a living. It's not a lecture, Alex said. It's data. Data is always a lecture when it's telling someone their life isn't viable. Fair point, Alex said. And then they left, actually climbed down off my boat and walked back toward the dock. Like they made a deliberate choice to respect my boundary, even though they'd violated it in the first place. I expected that to be the end of it. Portland has a lot of boats, a lot of docks, a lot of fishermen trying to make it work in an industry that's fundamentally changing. The ocean is big enough that you can avoid people if you want to. You can stick to your particular fishing grounds, work your particular nets, avoid the conversations you don't want to have. But Alex apparently wanted to have conversations with me specifically, because 3 days later, Alex showed up at the dock where I keep the Mary Catherine, standing next to a coffee truck with 2 cups of coffee in there, hands like they calculated, exactly when I'd be there. The day that Alex came on my boat, for a full working operation started at 4:30 in the morning, which is the time I've been waking up to go fishing for the last 15 years. There's something specific about that time of day. The world is still dark, still quiet, and there's a moment right before I head to the boat where I can pretend I'm still asleep. That none of the reality of the changing industry and the declining catches and the impossible future is actually happening. Then I get to the boat, and the reality comes back immediately. I went through my pre-dawn routine, checking the boat for damage, checking the equipment, checking the nets, checking the weather forecast one more time to make sure nothing catastrophic had developed overnight. Alex arrived with coffee from the same truck they'd stationed at the dock. They were wearing waders that suggested they'd actually invested in decent gear. They were moving carefully, but with purpose. Okay, I said. Let's go. We headed out into weather that was rough enough to be uncomfortable, but mild enough that the work was still doable. Swells about 4 feet. Wind maybe 15 knots. The kind of morning where you start questioning your life choices about 30 seconds after the dock is no longer visible. But ultimately you accept that this is what you've chosen and you keep moving. Alex was sick within 20 minutes, not dramatically, like in some kind of movie where the landlubber dramatically vomits over the rail, while the experienced fisherman looks on with knowing sympathy. More like a specific gray-faced nausea that makes people quiet and deeply regretful. We were probably 45 minutes from the fishing grounds, the boat moving through the swells with a specific rhythm. That comes from a whole design for this work. And Alex was looking at the ocean with the expression of someone whose body was actively questioning the life choices that had brought them to this specific moment. I should have felt satisfied. I should have felt like the universe was delivering cosmic justice for the judgment I'd received on the dock. Here was a marine biologist, someone who climbed onto my boat uninvited, someone who'd questioned my livelihood, someone who'd suggested I should stop fishing. Now, experiencing the specific misery of maritime work, but I didn't feel satisfied. I felt something else. I felt almost protective. I felt like maybe judgment was less important than the reality of actual suffering here, I said, reaching into the emergency kit and pulling out a ginger tablet. Chew this. Don't swallow it. Just chew and let it dissolve. It helps with the nausea. Alex looked at the tablet like it might be poison, but they chewed it anyway. By the time we reached the fishing grounds, Alex was functioning. Not happy, not enthusiastic, but functional in the way that matters when there's actual work to be done. And when I started setting nets, Alex was interested enough to stand there, watching, asking questions about process, why that depth, Alex asked as I was setting the first net. The species I'm targeting are running deeper this season. Climate change is shifting migration patterns. Warmer water temperatures are changing where the fish can survive, so I adjust my depth to follow them. I was working as I talked, moving through the familiar motions that I've been doing since I was 8 years old. It's like reading a book where someone's changing the text while you're trying to read it. You adapt or you fail. How do you know when you're adapting and when you're just participating in the decline? That was a good question, not a judgmental question. A genuine question that suggested Alex was actually thinking about the problem, instead of just documenting it. I admit it. I adjust because if I don't adjust, I don't catch fish. If I don't catch fish, I don't have income. If I don't have income, I lose the boat. If I lose the boat, I lose the thing that makes me feel like I have purpose. I was quiet for a moment. I don't know if I'm adapting to a changing ecosystem, or if I'm just changing my participation in destroying that ecosystem. I suspect it's probably both. That seemed to land with Alex. That specific moment of honesty about what was at stake. It wasn't just economics. It was identity. It was family legacy. It was the idea that I was the third generation carrying forward something that had been passed to me with the assumption that I would pass it forward to the fourth generation. Except the ocean wouldn't support it. The regulations wouldn't support it. The climate wouldn't support it. But I didn't know how to not be a fisherman. We hauled nets all day. The catch was better than the day Alex had showed up uninvited, the fishing gods, apparently approving of my moral crisis, or at least not actively punishing it. By mid-afternoon, Alex's nausea had faded, and they were actively helping. Learning how to sort catch, identifying juvenile fish that needed to be released, reading the ocean for information about what was underneath. They were learning the work. They were becoming, in some small way, part of the operation. When we headed back to port, the sun was starting to set, turning the water gold and pink in that specific way that makes you remember why people ever wanted to fish in the first place. It's not just work. It's relationship with the ocean. It's being small in the presence of something vast. It's understanding that you're part of a system that's bigger than yourself. Alex was quiet as we approached the dock. Not the silence of judgment. The silence of someone processing something difficult. "Thank you for letting me come," Alex said as we were tying up the boat. "Thank you for not making me feel terrible the whole time." I said, "I can't promise I won't make you feel terrible," Alex said. They were looking at the ocean, at the specific quality of light that happens at sunset on the water. Because I think what's happening to the ocean is terrible. And people like you commercial fishermen are participating in that terror. But I can promise that I'm not making you feel terrible personally. I'm scared about the ocean. And people like you, people who actually love the ocean, who understand what it means to live from it, people like you matter to that fear. Here's what changed. I started asking Alex questions instead of expecting judgment. We got coffee at a place near the docks where fishermen and marine scientists apparently didn't usually mix. It was called the Dock Worker. And it was the kind of place where you could get strong coffee and stale donuts. And the kind of company that didn't require conversation. But we talked anyway. "What are you actually researching?" I asked. "Like, what's the end goal? Are you trying to prove that fishing is bad? Are you trying to help fishermen? Are you just documenting the collapse?" "I'm trying to understand whether sustainable fishing is possible at commercial scales," Alex said. My initial research suggests that the answer is probably no. That commercial fishing as it currently exists is fundamentally incompatible with a healthy ocean. But I'm not interested in just documenting that conclusion. I'm interested in whether there are models that could work. Whether fishing could be restructured in ways that allow people to continue doing the work while the ecosystem actually recovers. That sounds impossible. Most things that matter sound impossible until someone figures out how to do them, Alex said. "The question is whether you want to figure it out." "I want to keep my boat," I said. "I want to keep doing the work. I want to not have to become someone entirely different. Those things might still be possible," Alex said. "But only if you're willing to change how you do the work." We started seeing each other regularly, not as a couple initially, as collaborators. Alex would come on fishing days when they could get time off from their research work. We'd talk about the ocean and the changes we were both observing, Alex from the research side, me from the work side. And slowly, the defensive posture I'd started with the idea that Alex was judging me, that scientists were the enemy, that environmental concerns were just obstacles to livelihood started shifting into something else. Alex wasn't judging me. Alex was scared about the same thing I was scared about. Alex just had data to back up the fear. Alex had research. Alex had documented evidence from other fisheries, other regions, other moments in history where fishing communities had faced similar crises. And some of them had adapted. Some of them had figured out models that worked. Some of them had found ways to keep the work alive while keeping the ocean alive too. Around the third time, we got coffee, this time at a different place, a slightly nicer place. Somewhere that felt less like we were just occupying space. And more like we were deliberately choosing to spend time together, I kissed Alex. Not because the moment was perfect, not because the timing was romantic, but because the moment was honest. And I hadn't expected to find honesty with someone who'd initially seemed like an opponent. I like you, Alex said when we pulled back. Even though you're destroying the ocean, I like you too, I said. Even though you're making me face facts I don't want to face. The facts don't care whether you want to face them, Alex said. But I do. I care whether you face them. Because if you actually engage with what's happening instead of just participating in it, then maybe we can figure out something that works. But here's the complication. The more I worked with Alex, the more I understood that my boat couldn't operate sustainably as it was currently operating. I wasn't catching enough fish to make the economics work unless I pushed harder. Pushed into less sustainable practices. Pushed into taking more from an ocean that was already giving less. The math was simple and devastating. I needed approximately 130 pounds of commercial fish per day to cover my operating costs. My current sustainable catch, the amount I could take without devastating juvenile populations, or non-target species, was roughly 170 pounds per day. That 30-pound gap was the difference between maintaining my business and going under. I could close that gap by fishing deeper, by using larger nets with smaller mesh, by staying out longer, by pushing into areas that were supposed to be recovery zones, by participating more completely in a system that was destroying the ecosystem. Or I could accept that the current model didn't work and needed to be fundamentally transformed. My father called one morning in early November. He was 72 years old, officially retired, but still consulting with other boat owners, still invested in the industry that had defined his entire life. I'd been avoiding his calls because I knew this conversation was coming. I heard you've been seen with a marine biologist, he said. Not a question, a statement of fact. Information he'd received through the fishing community's surprisingly efficient gossip network. Yeah, I have. You know better than to get involved with someone from the scientific community, he said. His voice had that quality of concern that sometimes comes across as judgment. They don't understand what fishing is. They see it as an environmental problem instead of as a way of life. They'll pull you away from what matters. What if it's both? I asked. What if it's both a way of life and an environmental problem? That stopped him. My father, who'd lived his entire life knowing what fishing was, never questioning whether it should be, never imagining that something could be both survival and destruction, had to think about the possibility that something could be both. If you start listening to that kind of thinking, you'll lose the boats, he said finally. You'll lose the business. You'll lose what your grandfather built. You'll become someone different than who you're supposed to be. What if who I'm supposed to be can't exist anymore? I asked. What if the ocean can't support the version of fishing that grandfather built? What if I have to adapt or disappear? Then we adapt, my father said. We don't listen to people who want us to stop fishing. We listen to people who understand the data, I said. We listen to people who can help us see what's actually happening. So, we can adapt without destroying everything in the process. You're not thinking clearly. My father said, that woman, that marine biologist, she's clouding your judgment. She's making me think more clearly than I have in years, I said. She's helping me see that tradition and sustainability aren't opposites. They're challenges that need solving together. My father didn't respond. The line just went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, don't lose the boat, Danny. Don't lose what matters just because you want to impress someone new. But he was wrong about what matters. What matters isn't the boat. What matters is the work. What matters is the ocean. What matters is finding a way to do both. And finding that way seemed like it might require losing the version of the boat my father had built. So I could build something new, Alex, and I started talking seriously about what sustainable fishing could look like. It wasn't going to be the same as what my family had done for 70 years. But it could still be fishing. It could still be commercial. It could still be work that mattered. We applied for research grants that would fund alternative fishing methods. We connected with other boat owners who were asking the same questions. We organized a community meeting where fishermen and scientists actually talked to each other instead of past each other, instead of seeing each other as adversaries, instead of assuming that what was good for one side was necessarily bad for the other. The meeting was held at a community center in Northeast Portland, a space that wasn't obviously aligned with either fishing interests or environmental interests. We got maybe 40 people, some fishermen, some marine scientists, some people who were just interested in what was happening to the ocean. I presented the basic problem. The catch I needed to survive was larger than the catch the ocean could sustainably provide. Alex presented the data about what was happening to marine populations. Then we opened it up for discussion. It was messy at first. Fishermen were skeptical of scientific claims. Scientists were frustrated by what they saw as fishermen's refusal to engage with evidence. But slowly, something shifted. People started asking genuine questions instead of making defensive statements. People started listening instead of preparing rebuttals. One older fisherman, maybe 70, clearly been doing this for a long time, raised his hand. If we reduce catch by 30% to make it sustainable, he said, how do we make up the income difference? That was the real question. That was the thing nobody wanted to talk about. Because the answer required systemic change. It required understanding that the problem wasn't just fishing. The problem was the entire market structure that incentivized unsustainable practices. Premium markets, Alex said. If we market sustainable caught fish as premium product, we can actually increase the price per pound even if we're selling fewer pounds. Restaurants and high-end markets have indicated willingness to pay more for provenance-verified sustainable catch. Who's going to do the verification? Someone asked. We are, Alex said. That's part of what the research collective does. We document sustainable practices. We certify catch. We work with markets to verify supply chains. By the end of the meeting, we had interest from 8 other boat owners. Not commitment, but genuine interest in exploring whether this model could work. By November, I'd retooled the Mary Catherine to work with selective fishing methods. That reduced bycatch significantly. It took money I didn't have. Money that required me to take out a loan specifically for equipment. It took time away from fishing while I was installing new nets, learning new techniques, adjusting my understanding of how to do the work. By January, I was part of a cooperative of boats doing sustainable practices. We'd hired a researcher partially funded by Alex's research collective to help us document our practices, track our outcomes, verify that we were actually reducing environmental impact while maintaining viable economics. By March, we landed a contract to supply restaurants that specifically wanted sustainably caught fish. Not premium pricing yet, but pricing that was slightly better than conventional catch. Just enough to make the economics work. It wasn't the same business as before. The profit margins were different. The volumes were smaller, but the economics actually worked. And more importantly, it felt honest in a way that my previous fishing hadn't felt honest. My father visited one of the restaurants that was buying our fish. He ordered the sustainable caught salmon and sat down with his wine and his skepticism, and his decades of believing that the only way to fish was the way he'd always fished. I wasn't there, but the restaurant manager told me what happened. My father tasted the fish. He asked questions about where it came from, how it was caught, what made it different from conventional catch. Then he asked for my phone number. When he called, he didn't apologize. That's not how my father operates. But he said, the fish is good. The way you're catching it, that's not the same as what I did, but maybe that's okay. Maybe that's actually what fishing is supposed to be now. 1 year after Alex had climbed onto my boat uninvited, we were sitting on the Mary Catherine at dawn, watching the sun come up before we headed out to fish. It was becoming a ritual, this moment of stillness before work. This time together that didn't require anything except presence. You know, what's weird? Alex said. What? A year ago, I was documenting the collapse of the fishing industry as an environmental problem. Now, I'm actually part of a solution that lets people keep fishing while the ocean gets healthier. Alex was smiling. That feels like I'm doing something that matters. You are, I said. You made me face what was actually happening instead of pretending everything was fine. You made me understand that fishing isn't an enemy. It's people trying to survive in a system that's broken. It's people who love the ocean and want to keep working it. But the work as currently structured is incompatible with a healthy ocean. Alex looked at the water. We both helped each other see something true. I wanted to keep doing that, I said. The seeing things together part. The building something together part. The figuring out how to make work matter without destroying everything part. I took their hand. I want to build a life with you. Yeah, Alex said. I want to do that too. Epilogue, 2 years later, Mary Catherine is registered in both our names now. Technically, it's still under Danny Russo. Some of the fishing community isn't entirely ready for a business card that says Russo and Rivera, but we both captain it. We both make decisions about where we fish, what we fish, how we manage the boat. We both answer to the work. The cooperative has expanded to include 12 boats. We've developed protocols for sustainable fishing that actually work. We've documented decreases in bycatch by approximately 40%, while maintaining economically viable operations. We've created markets for our fish that value sustainability not just as environmental ethics, but as actual product differentiation. We've proven not to everyone, but to enough people that fishing can be a livelihood without being destructive. Alex still does research part-time, now specifically on sustainable fishing practices in the Pacific Northwest. That research funds part of the cooperative's work. My commercial fishing funds the rest. We've created a hybrid model where science and practice inform each other constantly. We live in a small house in Northeast Portland, close enough to the docks that I can walk to work, close enough to Alex's research facility that they can split time between field work and data analysis. We host cooperative meetings and scientific discussions and the kind of conversations that wouldn't have seemed possible 2 years ago. Fisherman, and scientists actually understanding each other, actually finding common ground. My father visits regularly. He's fascinated by what we're doing, by the sustainable methods, by the market dynamics, by the specific way that we've managed to keep fishing alive while changing what fishing means. He's thinking about converting one of his retired boats into a demonstration vessel for training younger fishermen in sustainable practices. Alex's family, the family that lost their boats a generation ago, came to visit last month. They walked the Mary Catherine, looked at the equipment, listened to Alex explain what we're doing. At the end, Alex's father said, "This is what we thought fishing could be. This is what we hoped for. I'm glad someone's making it work. The work is hard. The ocean is still changing faster than we can adapt. The regulations are still increasing because the problems are real and documented and undeniable. But in our small corner of the fishing world, we've built something sustainable, something honest, something that serves both people and the ocean. And every time we take the Mary Catherine out, every time we catch fish that are the right size and the right species and caught in a way that doesn't devastate the ecosystem, we're saying this doesn't have to be a choice between survival and responsibility. We can have both if we're willing to change how we think about the work." The restaurant that first bought from us has expanded to selling our fish in 3 locations. They created a menu section specifically highlighting our sustainable catch. They tell customers where the fish came from, what boat caught it, what methods were used. They've trained their staff to explain the story, the choices, the specific way that this fish represents something different than conventional commercial catch. The market premium started at 10% above conventional pricing. Now it's 30%, not because we created artificial scarcity, but because customers increasingly understand that what they're eating represents something, a choice, a commitment, a different relationship with the ocean than industrial fishing represents. We've been approached by other fishing communities in California, in Alaska, in Washington State. They're asking if the model can be replicated, if small fishing operations can actually survive by shifting to sustainable practices, if it's possible to keep cultural traditions alive, while accepting that those traditions need to evolve. The answer is yes, but only if people are willing to do what I did. Only if they're willing to admit that the old way isn't working anymore. Only if they're willing to let someone outside their world help them see clearly. That's what Alex gave me. Not judgment, but clarity. Not condemnation, but love expressed through honest assessment of what's happening and willingness to help build something different. Last week, my father actually used the word proud when he was describing what we're doing to another fisherman at the dock. He said, "My son's doing something that matters. He's keeping fishing alive, but he's doing it in a way that respects the ocean." That's what fishing should have always been. I don't know if he fully understands it yet. I don't know if he's completely let go of the idea that the traditional way was the only way. But he's trying. He's asking questions. He's listening to the data. And he's recognizing that transformation isn't betrayal. Sometimes transformation is the only way to honor what came before. Alex and I are talking about buying a second boat. Not immediately, the finances don't quite work yet. But we're looking at the possibilities. We're thinking about expansion. We're thinking about how to scale what we built without losing the values that made it work in the first place. We're also thinking about marriage. Not right now, but eventually. We're thinking about making official and legal what's already true. That we're building something together. That we're committed to this work. That we're committed to each other. The ocean is still changing. Climate change isn't slowing down just because we've figured out one sustainable fishing model. The water is still warming. The species are still migrating. The ecosystem is still under pressure. But in the middle of all that uncertainty, we've built something certain. We've built a business that works. We've built a relationship that works. We've built a commitment to each other and to this work that feels like it could actually last. That's enough. That's more than I could have imagined 2 years ago when Alex first climbed onto my boat and asked me why I was destroying the ocean. I've learned since then that the ocean isn't destroyed by individual fishermen trying to survive. The ocean is destroyed by systems that incentivize destruction. And changing systems requires people willing to see clearly and build differently. Alex saw that clearly. I'm grateful that they saw me clearly too, not as a problem, but as a person who can help solve a problem if given the right partnership.